From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
The rough and tumble of journalism politics is just that, and we don't normally complain when people complain about us.
The editor of the Sunday Times is normally behind the headlines, not the focus of them.
But on this occasion, I just think it went way too far.
When the Sunday Times published an explosive piece reporting on financial irregularities in the think tank that was fighting to get Keir Starmer elected, they didn't like it. That part was to be expected. But what came next definitely wasn't.
The response wasn't just to apologise, accept they got something wrong and learn from it. It was to engage a corporate intelligence firm to try and analyse the sourcing, the origins and the funding of the story. It was a very, very odd thing to do.
This firm produced a report that attempted to discredit two of the most respected political journalists, investigating their personal lives and claiming they were part of a Russian conspiracy against the state.
When the report came in, Labour Together were quite happy to talk about its conclusions widely around Westminster, claim that the Sunday Times was being used by the Russian state, which is the most absurd thing I've ever heard.
These smear tactics weren't being used by the Kremlin or Tehran, but by a group that was run by a current minister in the British government. So who are Labour Together? How much influence do they still wield in Westminster? And what made them attack our colleagues at the Sunday Times? The story today, the Labour activists paying to smear journalists.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to lie. When the first reports came out, so Democracy for Sale, which is this investigative Substack run by Peter Bjorgen, I just couldn't believe it. I felt disgusted.
That's Emanuele Midolo, Manu to friends in the newsroom, who's an investigations reporter at the Sunday Times. He's been pouring through the secret report commissioned by Labour Together into his own colleagues.
Then I saw the report which we obtained, and I was even more incredulous because the allegation that my colleagues could be Russian assets was so far-fetched. I mean, it was just ludicrous. Gabriel has done some amazing work on Russia. I've often had the privilege of working with him on investigations, and he's sanctioned by Russia, as many of us journalists at the Times and Sunday Times are. And Harry York has written one of the best stories last year, in my opinion, about how Russia was secretly spying on our fleet, our British nuclear submarines, for which I think he's just got nominated at the Press Awards for Scoop of the Year or Investigation of the Year. And he's about to join the Royal Navy, which, makes it even more ridiculous to say that he could be a Russian spy. But as Karl Marx used to say, first as a tragedy, then as a farce.
Manu, we'll get on to exactly how those wild allegations came about in a moment. But in order to understand that, we have to understand the other character in this story, and that is Labour Together. Tell us a bit about them. Who are they?
Yeah, it's got this great name, right? I mean, very sort of peaceful sounding. But for a long time, Labour Together was this sort of secretive think tank or pressure group, whatever you want to call it, within the Labour Party that no one outside the party had really heard of. They didn't have a website. They didn't have a Twitter account. It was funded in 2015, but it really started to gain influence under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, or rather during the sort of disastrous leadership of Jeremy Corbyn and the kind of apocalyptic results at the 2019 election.
Now, it could hardly have been a worse night for Labour, as one by one, that so-called red wall of rock-solid heartlands crumbled into dust, the worst result for the party in living memory.
The Conservatives have bulldozed Labour's traditional defences in the Midlands and the North.
I feel really angry about this, that we persevered with Corbyn.
Jeremy Corbyn might be on the way out, but where does the party go now?
So Labour Together, which was a moderate group, became more and more powerful within the party. Now, we would have known very little about this if Gabriel and Harry had not published a sensational investigation in November 2023. So a good 8 months before the 2024 general election, which obviously resulted in a landslide for Keir Starmer. The investigation revealed to the public, for the first time really, how Labour Together was run by this mysterious figure called Morgan McSweeney, and how this guy was known within the sort of Westminster circles, was obviously known as one of Keir Starmer's closest advisors, but the general public didn't really know much about who this guy was, where he was coming from, and how he has essentially been plotting to get Starmer into number 10 Downing Street.
Labour Together, it's working in the background to try and get Keir Starmer elected. Why was the work of Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York so difficult for them? Just spell out exactly what their journalism had revealed.
Well, one of the most explosive revelations within that piece from November 2023 was how Labour Together had failed to declare a huge amount of donations, £730,000 between 2017 and 2020, which is when McSweeney was Labour Together's leader. During that time, the group was later found to have breached electoral law over 20 times, and it was fined by the Electoral Commission. But to this day, neither McSweeney or Keir Starmer have actually addressed the issue. So that was one of the biggest revelations within the story. And well, we now know that it caused a huge panic within Labour Together. They were wondering who Gabriel and Harry's sources were for this stuff. Funnily enough, one of the things that Gabriel and Harry found was that some of this money was coming from donors who had much stronger links to Russia than the reporters behind our story. So one of the biggest donors is a guy called Martin Taylor, who was a hedge fund manager who made his fortune at this thing called Nevsky Capital, which is a multi-billion-pound Cayman Islands fund known for investing in Russian companies such as Gazprom, for example.
And there's no suggestion of any wrongdoing by Martin Taylor. Gabriel and Harry have put out a piece which looks at what Labour Together is, what it does. It's an organisation that hasn't had much scrutiny before, and vitally that they've broken the rules in terms of finance. How did Labour Together respond to that?
Well, we now know that days after the article appeared, Josh Simons, who had been, at that point, he'd succeeded McSweeney as the leader of Labour Together, and is now a Cabinet Office Minister, commissioned this PR and lobbying firm, originally from the US, which is called APCO, APCO, to look into the Sunday Times investigation, more specifically, to look into the authors of the investigation.
Now, Manu, how normal is that? Because the Sunday Times, we often write political stories. There will be political stories that parties or certain politicians don't like. How normal is it to commission a separate company to look into the authors?
I don't think it's normal. I can tell you that the Labour politician and former MP John Cruthers, who actually helped found Labour Together in 2015, told Peter Geoghegan at Democracy for Sale that the revelations about Labour Together commissioning APCO were shocking, extraordinary, described as dark shit, pardon my French, but that's how.
Wow,
that's how.
And that's a politician who was part of Labour Together views it.
He actually founded it, but yeah, I mean, just to go back to your question about what did they do when the report came out, the leader of Labour Together at that point, Simons, said he was worried that the information that had been published in the Sunday Times had come as the result of a hacking of either Labour Together or the Electoral Commission. But instead of hiring, some digital investigators to see if there had been a hack on their side.
Cybersecurity of some sort.
Yeah, some cybersecurity experts. They hired instead this lobbying firm to look into what they called the backgrounds and motivations of our reporters. And the person who actually did it was, unfortunately, a former Sunday Times colleague, Tom Harper. Now, we know that McSweeney was aware of the decision, and the Sunday Times has obtained a copy of the report, which was dated January 2024, and it was codenamed Operation Cannon, marked private and confidential. It was all very sinister, but the details of the report had never been published before until Sunday.
So tell us about that. You suddenly had this report that people had heard of, nobody had actually read it before, in front of you. It's based on the people you work with, colleagues you know very well. What exactly did it say?
So APCO produced a 58-page dossier, effectively. And what we were shocked to see, what I was shocked to see within the report, was that the bulk of that, something like 10 pages of the report, were actually specifically dedicated to Gabriel Pogrund. It was just pages upon pages of deeply personal and most of the times false claims about Gabe and about Harry, who was also named as a person of significant interest. They got into Gabriel's background, into his faith. They said that because he was Jewish, actually they said because he was a Jew, the author of the report was surprised to see that Gabriel had certain political leanings, which I know that most of this stuff is completely false. I know Gabriel very well. I've been working with him for 6 years. And, you know, there were just some glaring errors even in terms of his background. It was accused of having not behaved in a professional manner in different stories, and some of the stories that had nothing to do with Labour Together. It was a sort of assassination that had very little to do with Gabriel or Harry's sources about this specific piece, and attacked Gabriel directly, rather than focusing on the journalism or the sources of the information.
We should say that APCO worldwide says it's in the process of undertaking a detailed internal review of the project. But as you've highlighted, this is a deeply personal attack. It talks about Gabriel's faith, it talks about his political views. I mean, it is, as you said, it's a political assassination of a highly respected reporter, one of the reporters who's broken more stories across Westminster than probably anyone else in Fleet Street.
Other than being a colleague and a friend, Gabriel is one of the most known reporters, not just in the lobby, but on Fleet Street. You know, his investigations are wide-reaching and he's been reporting without grace and favour. The fact that he could have been accused of being some sort of Russian spy, or that the reason why he was doing these investigations was to damage Britain, is just ludicrous.
And by attacking two journalists at the Sunday Times and trying to make out these links with Russia, it's basically attacking the integrity of the Sunday Times itself, as Ben Taylor, the editor, has pointed out.
I think this is what really angered me. Number one, it was the attack on Gabriel. Two was the attack on the institution of the Sunday Times, which, as I say, we're used to being criticised. That's fine. But this was much more insidious. And three, they ran with those conclusions in and around Westminster to try and get up a campaign that you cannot trust the Sunday Times. They're essentially being used by a foreign state, which is the most absurd thing I've ever heard.
This would have undermined the reputation of what the Sunday Times does.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we were shocked to find out about was that the report's contents were shared with many people in Westminster, and especially within the Labour Party in 2024 and possibly even last year. The people who've seen it include cabinet ministers, special advisors. So it became a kind of whispering campaign in Westminster against Gabriel, against Harry, and against the Sunday Times.
And Manu, this wasn't just circulated amongst people in Westminster, where obviously it could have had a terrible effect in terms of a whispering campaign or which journalists people are prepared to speak to. We understand it also went to some government agencies.
Yeah, I mean, it's unclear how many people have seen, read, or even obtained this dossier, but we do know that a redacted version of the report was sent to the Cybersecurity Centre, which is part of GCHQ, essentially in the hope that the spooks would launch an investigation into the Sunday Times. We know that GCHQ did not open an investigation. But what happened essentially on the back of this report being circulated within Westminster was that no other major news organization picked up on Gabriel and Harry's investigation. The Electoral Commission didn't look into this any further, and Labour Together could sort of dismiss this as old news.
So this story about Labour Together not declaring all of its finances and being fined, rather than being everywhere in the press, was effectively suppressed, or it might have been.
Yeah, we think so. And I think the Cabinet Office said that they're looking into this. If I can be completely honest, I found it slightly ironic, considering that the current Cabinet Minister, Josh Simons, is the one who commissioned APCO the report. Simons was Labour Together's leader at that time. And now he said that APCO went rogue and that he was shocked that the firm would look into Gabriel and Harry. But we have obtained evidence that that's exactly what APCO had promised to do, and Labour Together paid them £36,000 for it.
Wow. So there is a danger here for the public who might want answers to how on earth all of this happened, that, as you say, the Cabinet Office is being asked to look into the Cabinet Office Minister. It does feel a bit like they're marking their own homework. Manu, for you, as somebody who's written a book about an era when there were spies in the office, there were spies working inside the Sunday Times.
Russian spies, of all people.
Russian spies, in fact.
Yeah.
How weird was it to suddenly find this story about the modern newsroom, which is a world apart, raising the question of Russian assets working at the forefront of political journalism?
Well, it's funny because I wrote this book last year, which is about the Sunday Times journalist that was killed in mysterious circumstances. This book, Murder in Cairo, spoiler alert, the guy we revealed was actually a KGB operative. And when we were doing the promotion for the book, people would ask me, would this happen nowadays? You know, could any of this happen these days, you know, having spies within the newsroom? And I always said that I think the current spies are in IT. They are the sorts of Russian hackers doing the hacks. So again, I feel like if people want to investigate alleged hacks into their own organizations, they would rather hire cybersecurity experts rather than a lobbying firm expert in the sort of dark art.
Manu, you were telling us a bit about this smear campaign that came about after the group Labour Together was scared of some of the journalism that was being produced by the Sunday Times and asked another company, they paid another company to come in and dig around on the journalists. Tell us a bit about Labour Together. How much power do they still have?
I would say a lot of the people who are now in government are actually either on the board or are sort of close supporters of Labour Together. The group has boasted about its key role in Starmer's election. And Labour Together is very much still supported by people like Rachel Reeves, Wes Streeting, Shabana Mahmood. So we are talking about a group that sits literally at the heart of Starmer's government still.
Manu, we should say the editor of the Sunday Times, Ben Taylor, has been talking about what he'd like to see happen.
I do think the real people who haven't spoken here are members of the Cabinet and Morgan McSweeney, who were fully aware of this and were quite happy to talk about it around Westminster, and even tried to get the story going in another paper to suggest that the Sunday Times was being used by the Russian state. Now, they are the people that I would really like to hear from, but I'm not holding my breath.
Manu, what are the questions that remain for you?
There are still questions that neither Labour Together, nor Starmer, nor Morgan McSweeney, who obviously resigned week before last as Chief of Staff, There are still questions that no one is answering. Where did the donation come from? Who were the donors? Why were not these donations declared? And why has Morgan McSweeney dismissed this as an admin error?
So how is this latest scandal playing out in Westminster? We got in touch with one of our correspondents on the ground, in the heart of government.
I'm Ben Clatworthy, I'm Whitehall editor at The Times.
Ben, these latest revelations come at a time when things are already quite tricky for Keir Starmer. He's just survived a moment that looked like it could have been the end of his leadership. How damaging is this story for him? I mean, this is a think tank which he's very closely associated to.
Well, it's another setback for a Prime Minister whose judgment has massively been called into question recently. There's been whole scandals over, as we know, appointments and who knew what when. And this, again, has all the hallmarks of that. It's just shady operating. It's backroom. It's dark arts. And it's the type of thing that basically reduces trust in politics with the public.
Yeah, and we've heard a lot of the criticisms from backbenchers and people around Keir Starmer sort of calling it a toxic boys' club at the centre. Morgan McSweeney, obviously a key part of the Number 10 operation until last week, now gone, was a very big figure in Labour Together as well. How is Number 10 functioning without him?
You know, he was a huge force in Number 10. He was a huge force at the Prime Minister's side for the past 8 years. And it's interesting that Keir Starmer, before coming into office, spent a lot of time saying country first, party second, country first, party second. And actually what we've seen is it's Keir Starmer first, party second, country third. And that's what a lot of people are talking about, is the way that he's operated. And actually, you know, Keir Starmer got rid of Morgan McSweeney to save himself. We've seen him do that in the past, that he makes decisions to save his own skin. Tim Allen, the Director of Communications, he resigned a week last Monday. He was brought in back in the autumn. He only survived 5 months. He was a force under Tony Blair back then in the early noughties. He was brought in to try and get the public to listen to Keir Starmer's messages. That didn't work. He resigned as well. And actually the whole thing unravelled. But yes, there is definitely a change in atmosphere in Number 10. Some senior women have been promoted. There's concern that that was only Keir Starmer doing that to address the complaints about it being a boys' club, but I'm told that the attitude is very different. And actually, speaking to one special advisor last week, they said it's noticeably different feeling in the building.
How is that change of guard going? Because we know he's still struggling to find a permanent chief of staff. We've been told Jonathan Powell isn't going to do it. And there's already controversy about who might be the next cabinet secretary.
Well, the trouble is that you get to a point in any premiership where it's difficult to attract top talent if you're trying to attract people externally into a role when you are basically have people counting down the days until you're forced to resign. It was interesting in the dying days of the Conservative government that we started seeing clever special advisors were the first to get external jobs, because all of these special advisors instantly lose their job if their minister goes. And then the clever ones thought, well, I don't want to be one of 50 Tory special advisors looking for a job. Keir Starmer, extraordinary, 18 months into a government, but actually really struggling to attract new talent because people just don't know how long he's going to be there for.
It's very telling. How important is Labour Together still? I mean, will it help to determine who wins a leadership contest if there is one?
It is a very influential think tank, but the reality is that actually it's likely that there will be a completely different change. You know, Angela Rayner, for example, very popular with the membership, is of the left of the party. And actually it looks like there's going to be a marked change in who is the next leader. The idea that, you know, you get a sort of Starmerite following is looking increasingly unlikely.
And Ben, a week ago, we thought we were going to be in the midst of a leadership challenge by now. It hasn't happened. How are those candidates faring, having, you know, as some people have said, having bottled it?
Well, it's interesting because actually Keir Starmer ended the week with his currency being valued more than it was at the beginning of the week. Number 10 managed to use the power of number 10, something that no candidate has, to basically run a major whipping operation within the space of an hour. They got cabinet ministers to all tweet in support of the Prime Minister. What was originally expected around lunchtime last week was that, we heard the news that the Scottish Labour leader, Anna Sarwar, was going to go over the top.
The distraction needs to end, and the leadership in Downing Street has to change.
West Streeting has been accused of being in cahoots with the Labour leader in Scotland, Anna Sarwar, to try and oust the Prime Minister.
But actually, then you spoke to people, and for various reasons, West Streeting didn't think it was the right time. Angela Rayner has an HMRC investigation into stamp duty hanging over her. For both of them, last week was not the moment. And actually, Keir Starmer emerged stronger, having got this rally of support, and definitely is safe now until May.
In some ways, people will think he's also been strengthened by having removed a bit of that toxic boys' club that might help him build bridges with his own party. In terms of the people implicated in this Labour Together story, we know that Josh Simons is still a Cabinet Office minister. We're told that the Cabinet Office are now investigating. Is that going to convince people that there's a proper process?
I think the Cabinet Office were sort of bounced into saying something. I think that in reality, it's going to need to be an independent investigation. I don't think that's going to work. I think it's going to be very difficult for Josh Simons to keep his position in the Cabinet Office if he's found to be as implicated as it seems in this production of this document. But yes, there's going to be huge questions over this. And also the Cabinet Office are already busy investigating. They're looking at Peter Mandelson at the moment. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of investigations, and it's a lot of noise that is really, really unhelpful if you're the Prime Minister trying to get on with the job.
That was Ben Clatworthy, Whitehall editor for The Times, and before that, Emanuele Midolo, investigations reporter at The Sunday Times. The producers today were Julia Webster and Micaela Arneson. The executive producer was Kate Lamble. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. Don't forget to listen to our sister podcast, The State of It, with all the latest gossip from Westminster, starring our very own Gabriel Pogrund. And if you'd like to get in touch with us about this or any other episode, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.